world, as is our event tonight, In Quest of the Historical Adam, and it was released just a few weeks ago by Eerdmans. Our format for tonight will be an interview, and here to interview Dr. Craig is Jesper Kronhamn, who has a doctorate in genetics and works as a student pastor at Umeå Universitet. So we are doing this event tonight from 3 locations, with me being in Stockholm, Jesper, as well as a live or sort of live audience in Umeå, and Dr. Craig from Atlanta. After the interview, there will be an opportunity to post questions, and I will give instructions for that later. And now a warm welcome to you, Dr. Craig, and Jesper. I will hand it over to you to do the interview.
Thank you.
So it was my pleasure to read your book, Craig, In Quest of the Historical Adam. And I have also to say that very much welcome back to Umeå, even though you are here now in a digital form. You were here in 1999 and had 2 debates. One of them was with Ingvar Johansson about the existence of God. And it was, I think it was the first time that I heard an academic debate over God's existence. And I think it was very thrilling for me to listen to the debate. And I realized that you have debating a lot of topics. Among one of the main topics is maybe the existence of God. So how would you view your 30 years of debating, and what would you say about the arguments for the existence of God? How do they stand today?
Over those 30 years, I have debated these arguments with the most prominent atheists and agnostics in the world. And I have to say, in all honesty, I have been really impressed at how well these arguments stand up. When I reflect on them, I sometimes just shake my head and say, wow, these are really good arguments. And so I think the case for God's existence is very robust today. And there are many young Christian philosophers who are exploring new arguments for God's existence that weren't on the table 3 decades ago. And so the trend, I think, is continuing.
You have been a great inspiration for me. But now you have written your latest book, In Quest of the Historical Adam. It has been out, as Martin said, for some weeks. And I think it will be an influential book. I think you have done a very thorough research in this. Yes. And you start to say in the book that no matter what you say or write about the early chapters of Genesis, you are in a lot of trouble with a lot of people. And people on both the left and right can be expected to be upset with this book, and unfortunately its author. So what do you have in mind here?
Well, this has already come true. People who are to the left of me, secularists and revisionists who deny the historicity of Adam and Eve, have denounced the book as backward and unscientific and just impossible. On the other hand, people to the right of me who interpret Genesis 1 to 11 in a very literalistic way are angry with me because I say that you do not need to interpret these narratives with a sort of wooden literalism, that a lot of the language is figurative or metaphorical. And so people on both sides have been very upset with me, unfortunately.
Yeah, and one could encourage everyone to read the book and then come with constructive criticism, maybe.
Yes, I welcome, and I mean this, I welcome criticism and pushback. But what I've been getting so far have been mainly emotional reactions from people who have not even read the book.
And you do both a biblical and a scientific exploration of Adam and Eve. And I think one could say something about your perspective on theology and science. I was interviewed by a journalist here in Umeå, and when he realized that I both had a PhD in genetics and was a pastor, he called me for a walking contradiction. So obviously he thought that theology and science was not compatible at all. Yeah. So what is your view on the interaction between science and theology?
My philosophy professor in university taught us that all truth is God's truth. All truth belongs to God, whether that truth comes from the scriptures or whether it's given to us by modern science. And so ultimately, science and the Bible have to be in accord with each other. And so when we find an apparent conflict, we need to try to work hard to review whether we're interpreting the Bible correctly and to make sure that we have understood the scientific evidence correctly. Ultimately, I think these must be in accord with each other.
You start your exploration with the biblical questions, and you take the scientific ones afterwards. Any thoughts behind that?
Thank you for noticing that. That is a very important methodology in the book. I want to determine what my commitments are as a Bible-believing Christian, independently of what modern science has to say. I want to avoid the danger of what is called concordism. Concordism is trying to read modern science into the biblical text. And concordism is simply a bad hermeneutic. We need to understand these ancient texts as they would have been understood by the original author and audience at the time they were written. And so we need to bracket the deliverances of modern science and to read this ancient literature independently and on its own account and discover, what does this say? What is the meaning of this text? If I'm a Bible-believing Christian, what are my biblical commitments? And then it is only after having determined those biblical commitments, then I then turn to contemporary science and ask, are these biblical commitments compatible with the deliverances of modern science? Or is there some sort of conflict here?
And I think that the quest you have, the historical Adam and Eve, I think is one of the hottest in the area of science and faith. Yes. So why is the historical Adam so important?
Well, I think that depends on your theology, Jesper. For Lutherans, for example, who hold to the traditional doctrine of original sin, that we are guilty and culpable for Adam's sin, you have to have a historical Adam, because we cannot be held morally culpable for the wrongdoing of a fictitious person. If Adam never existed, then the doctrine of original sin goes by the board. Now, I myself don't hold to that version of the doctrine of original sin. Nevertheless, for me, I think this is an important issue because I think that the Bible commits us to the reality of a historical Adam and Eve. I think that our biblical commitments are that a historical pair existed who were the progenitors of the human race. And if you say that the Bible is wrong in teaching that, then you're going to have to revise your doctrine of inspiration in some way so that the Bible can teach error and yet still be inspired by God. And you're going to need to revise your Christology in such a way that Jesus can be divine and yet still hold false beliefs, because it's clear, I think, that Jesus did believe in a historical Adam and Eve. And so if you deny the historicity of Adam and Eve, I do think this will send serious reverberations through your theology that would force some rather unpleasant revisions that we ought rather not want to make.
Is it as serious as if we compare with what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, when he said that if Christ wasn't resurrected, our faith is in vain? Is it the same if Adam didn't exist?
No, not anywhere even near that. It's not nearly as central and important. You can deny the historicity of Adam and Eve without being a heretic or losing your salvation. You will just need to revise in a serious way your doctrine of inspiration, your Christology, and I think the doctrine of original sin. So it has these reverberations, but it is not a central doctrine of the Christian faith.
And I think that one of the most basic question, maybe the most basic question to understand this text, is to realize what type of a text we have in front of us.
Yes.
So what type of a text is the first 3 chapters in Genesis? And you have spent a great part of your book analyzing this text, and your conclusion is something that you called mytho-history, that is Genesis 1 to 11. So could you please explain mytho-history?
Yes, I want to emphasize that it's not just Genesis 1 to 3, but the whole of the primeval history, Genesis 1 to 11. I think one of the weaknesses of many treatments of Adam and Eve is that they isolate chapters 2 and 3 from the rest of the primeval narrative. And therefore, they do not get, I think, a convincing literary analysis of these chapters. When we take Genesis 1 to 11 as a block, as a whole, this primeval history, I think, plausibly should be classified as mytho-history. Now, what is that? Well, history is a narrative of real people that actually existed and real events that actually occurred. Myth is a sacred traditional narrative that seeks to ground the realities and values of the society present to the author in events of the primordial past. And I think that in Genesis 1 to 11, you have that blending or combination of myth and history.
So for me, it was encouraging to think in this direction when I realized that the church fathers, as Augustine and Origen, thought in that they interpreted the creation accounts in figurative matters long before any scientific exploration has occurred.
Exactly. And that's significant, isn't it? Because it completely removes the objection that I am allowing my belief in modern science to dictate my biblical exegesis. That is false. And I think the example of Origen and Augustine exposes the falsehood of that claim.
So given that it is mytho-history, how would we read the text if we have the garden? Do you think it was a real garden there?
That is the next significant question to be addressed. Given that this is a correct analysis of the genre of Genesis 1 to 11, how do you interpret it? And what I argue here is that myth is often intended to be read figuratively or metaphorically rather than with a sort of wooden literalness. And I think that this is very plausible with respect to Genesis 1 to 11, that there are many elements in it that we need not read in a literalistic fashion, but they are descriptions of events and people in the colorful and often fantastic language of myth. Now, with respect to the garden specifically, I'm actually rather sympathetic to the idea that there could have been an actual locale, the Garden of Eden. The way it's attempted to be located by these four rivers that flow out of Eden and into the garden, it's actually possible to give an account of such a locale that would have been in the Persian Gulf region. At the end of the last ice age, the Persian Gulf was actually a landlocked oasis all the way out to the Strait of Hormuz. But at the end of the ice age, the glaciers began to melt, and this made sea levels rise, and the Indian Ocean spilled over into the Persian Gulf and formed the Persian Gulf that we see today. And the Garden of Eden may have lain in the Persian Gulf, where the Tigris and Euphrates join in the so-called Ur-Shat river value that would have flowed into the garden.
The characteristics for the myth is the fantastic description of events. So if we...
Yes, well, could I, if I might interrupt,
yeah.
Compare in Greek mythology Mount Olympus. Mount Olympus is a real place in Greece, but the myth invested it with all these gods and goddesses living on it. And in a similar way, it could be that the Garden of Eden is an actual locale that was known to the author of the Pentateuch, but that the stories that he tells there are told in the colorful and figurative language of myth. And so you have things like these magical trees that impart immortality or knowledge of good and evil. If their fruit is eaten, you have the talking snake that tempts the man and the woman. And it may be that these are mythical elements in the telling of the story.
One question that I think is relevant to this perspective is that if we add a lot of millions of years before the creation of man, and God says to the creation that it's created good, how would you explain that God see this as good, even though you have sickness and death there long time before?
Now, it's important to see that this is not a question that is addressed in this book. You're raising a philosophical question about the problem of natural evil. And I would say that God knew that permitting animal predation and death was overall good for the flourishing of an ecosystem on this planet into which human beings could be introduced and the drama of salvation played out. So I would say that all of this is preparation for the advent of man and God's plan of salvation to bring people into relationship with him. And he knew that this was a good way to do it.
If I should take one last question on the theological part, if you should try to summarize what the creation story says about Adam and Eve, what does it? What is the main message you think that?
In the book, on page 202, I list some of the central truths that is taught by this. Let me just read some of these. 1, God is one, a personal, transcendent creator of all physical reality, perfectly good and worthy of worship. 2, God has designed the physical world and is the ultimate source of its structure and life forms. 3, man is the pinnacle of the physical creation, a personal, if finite, agent like God, and therefore uniquely capable of all Earth's creatures of knowing God. 4, mankind is gendered, man and woman being of equal value, with marriage given to mankind for procreation and mutuality, the wife being a helper to her husband. 5, work is good, a sacred assignment by God to mankind to steward the earth and its creatures. 8, man and woman alike have freely chosen to disobey God, suffering alienation from God and spiritual death as their just desert, condemned to a life of hardship and suffering during this mortal existence. And I also then list a number of other of the central truths, but those would be some of the central truths of Genesis 1 to 11 with respect to Adam and Eve.
Yeah, yeah. And the second part of the book, you are trying first to find the first human beings, and to be able to find the first human beings, we have to ask the question: what is a human being? What are we searching for? So what is a human being?
Yes. And my approach to this is very interesting. Rather than trying to give a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for being a human being, I say we look to ourselves as paradigms of what a human being is. Rather than trying to define human, we look to what a paradigm of a human being is, namely ourselves. And so we want to look in history when creatures like ourselves first appeared on this planet. And so what we'll be looking for will be, first of all, anatomical similarity to humans. And then secondly, we'll be looking for cognitive capacity for rational thought that is comparable to ourselves. And it's looking for the traces of those two things that will help us to determine when human beings first appeared on this planet.
Yeah, so you are searching for the first traces of human beings. And I think you have described that in a fantastic way, what type of traces you have found when it comes to different things. You could please explain for us your explorations of these artifacts.
Well, I mentioned the cognitive capacities of modern humans. And I appeal here to a pair of anthropologists, Sally McBrearty and Alison Brooks, who say that among anthropologists, there is something of a consensus about the cognitive capacities for modern human behavior. And these would include things like symbolic thinking, the ability to plan for the future, technological innovativeness, and so forth. And what Brooks and McBrearty then do is provide a list of about 25 what they call archaeological signatures of this kind of cognitive behavior. And this would include things like cave painting, use of pigment, big game hunting, crafting of tools of certain sorts of technological expertise, structured use of domestic space, and so on and so forth. And what is amazing is how many hundreds of thousands of years these archaeological signatures reach back into prehistory, so that it indicates that the origin of humankind on this planet is extremely ancient.
Yeah, how early do you find these signatures?
Well, at least 400,000 years ago. One of the most remarkable is a group of spears that were discovered in Germany in a coal mine at Schöningen. And these Schöningen spears are 6 to 7 foot spears that have been sculpted out of spruce or pine, and they are tapered toward the butt so that most of the weight is in the first 1/3 of the spear to assist in throwing. These spears have been dated in sedimentary layers to around 400,000 years ago. That was before Homo sapiens ever existed. And the German archaeologists had replicas made of these spears that were then tested by German Olympic athletes. And even though these athletes had never trained with these replicas, they found that these Jernigan spears were comparable to modern Olympic javelins in terms of the distance, the accuracy, and the penetration of the target that was achievable with these spears. It is just amazing. Nobody, I think, in his right mind can say that these spears were crafted by mere beasts. These are clearly human artifacts, and therefore indicate how old humanity is.
And you say that it was before Homo sapiens, so
yes.
They were probably made by Neanderthal, or even earlier?
Could have been Neanderthals, or it likely, I think, the last common ancestor of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. There were unfortunately no human remains found in Jernigan, but in Boxgrove, England, similar artifacts were found, and these were associated with the skeletal remains of Homo heidelbergensis, or Heidelberg man, who is thought to be the last common ancestor of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And so I think it's very plausible that these spears were the products of Heidelberg man.
When we look for a first human pair, I think that the strongest criticism of that hypothesis comes maybe from population genetics. And if I cite Dennis Venema in Adam and the Genome, he says that the sun is at the center of the solar system. Human evolved, and we evolved as a population. So Venema say that with some type of heliocentric certainty, that we have evolved as a population and not originated from a single pair. But you have, together with Joshua Swamedas, questioned that and shown that we could very well have originated from two individuals. So
yes, that's exactly right. And Dennis Venema has had to eat crow, as we say, with respect to his conclusion about heliocentric certainty. He was in conversation with Swamidas and the British geneticist Richard Buggs, and Venema came to admit that as long as this postulated human pair lived before 500,000 years ago, that there's nothing about population genetics that would rule out the existence of such a human pair as the universal ancestors of mankind. And since that was a conclusion I had already reached on the basis of the archaeological signatures alone, the challenge of population genetics just evaporated.
Interesting. If I should also ask one last question from your scientific investigation. So you say that you postulate that we have some non-human hominins that evolved into humans, and if you try to describe that, how it could have happened. I know that you have been engaged in writing kids' books, and if you should describe that on that type of a level, so how would you imagine the transition from non-humans into humans?
Now, let me make it very clear, Jesper, that I am not advocating this view. What I'm exploring is whether the existence of Adam and Eve would be compatible with such an evolutionary view, according to which they had non-human ancestors. And I think it is quite compatible. What you would postulate is some sort of a biological and spiritual renovation in a pair of non-human hominins that would lift them to the threshold of humanity. This would involve probably some sort of genetic regulatory mutation that would result in a radically increased cognitive capacity in the brain. And then I think also it would involve the infusion by God of a supernatural soul into that hominin. I'm a body-soul dualist, and I defend that view in the book and would say that the first human beings involved, first of all, this biological renovation that made their central nervous system capable of sustaining rational thought and deliberation, and then the infusion of a rational soul by God into that body.
Yeah, so you say that this is a possible or plausible explanation that isn't.
Yes, I would say that.
That isn't told in Genesis, but is in harmony.
No.
What we find there.
Yes, yes, and it would also be in harmony if someone wants to believe that God made Adam and Eve out of the dust of the earth, de novo. That would also be compatible. So I'm not advocating for one view. I'm simply saying that there's nothing about the deliverances of modern evolutionary theory that rules out a primordial human pair who are the ancestors of mankind.
Thank you very much for this conversation, Bill. And I think we will open up for questions both from the audience here and from the ones that are listening over the net.
That's right. Thank you, Jesper and Dr. Craig, for the first part of the program here. And it's now time for Q&A. We have, I see, a little over 20 minutes left to devote to that. And please type your questions in using the Q&A button in the bottom of your Zoom window. You can also upvote other people's questions if you think they have already formulated what you would like to hear a response to. Do try to keep your questions brief and focused and in the form of questions rather than statements. And it is all right to type your questions in Swedish if you want, and I will do my best to translate them into English for Dr. Craig. I will forward the questions to Dr. Craig, and then we'll generally pick questions from the top of the pile, those that have the most votes. Okay, Bill, are you ready?
I am.
Excellent. Well, the first question is from, there's a lot of jostling at the top of the pile here, but let's start with this one. Does Craig think of it as a problem that it would be 600,000 years between the fall and Abraham? Is it not a problem that God didn't do anything over several hundred thousands of years? There's a lot of generations of people that simply perished.
I think that Christ died for all of those people and that salvation is available for those people as well. But God had a universal plan for mankind, and in the fullness of time, he did call out Abraham to found the nation of Israel at the right time in history when it would have been ready to do so. But it's not as though he simply abandoned these people that came before. You know, Paul says in a couple of places in the New Testament, the times of ignorance God overlooked. But then finally, he sent forth Christ. And so I think of these as being times of ignorance during which people could come to know God through their response to God's revelation in nature and conscience, and that the benefits of Christ's blood would be applied to them. So I fully anticipate that we will meet Neanderthals and Denisovans and early humans in heaven.
Thank you. Okay, next question. If Adam and Eve are genealogical and not unique ancestors of all humans, and there were people outside and before the garden, it is possible to place Adam and Eve more recently.
Yes.
What are your reasons for thinking that Adam and Eve should be placed so far back in time and that there were no people outside the garden?
Yes, this is the key difference between my proposal and Josh Swamidas's proposal. He has a recent genealogical Adam. I have an ancient genealogical Adam. And I give three reasons as to why I think the ancient view is better. Number one, the whole purpose of the primeval history is to express God's universal interest in mankind, all human beings who have descended from Adam and Eve, not just an elect pair that he only recently selected a few thousand years ago. Otherwise, Old Testament scholars have asked, why not just begin the book of Genesis with the call of Abraham? If that's God's purpose, it ought to stop there. But the appending of this primeval history as a prefix to the calling of Abraham and the foundation of Israel is an expression of God's universal interest in all human beings and not just in a select couple and their descendants. Secondly, when you compare the origin account of humanity in Genesis 2 with ancient Near Eastern myths like the Atrahasis epic and others, it is always an interest in the origin of humanity as such that is expressed in these myths. This is a very, very common mythological motif. Where did humanity come from? And so I think that as an Israelite myth, it's trying to answer the same question. Where did humanity come from? But it gives, of course, a very, very different answer. And then the third reason I would give is that the text explicitly says this. There's nothing in the text about people outside the garden. On the contrary, it says in Genesis 2, there was no man to till the soil until God created Adam out of the dust of the earth. And it says there was found no one to be Adam's helper until he created Eve out of his side. And then she was called the mother of all living. So the narrative read at face value is about the origin of humanity, not the selection of a single couple out of a wider population of people alive at that time.
Okay, thank you. There's one question here that could serve as a quick, perhaps quick follow-up. Who was Cain's wife, in your view?
That is the only shred of evidence for people outside the garden. It is, I don't think you can base a theory on such a slim read as where did Cain get his wife. I imagine that what the author of the Pentateuch has done here is combine different traditions that aren't always exactly consistent with each other. We see that with Genesis 1 and 2 with regard to the creation of the animals and the vegetation and man. There are these inconsistencies. And similarly, if the story of Cain and his wife was originally an independent tradition, which he's then put together with the story of Adam and Eve and the fall, you could get those sort of apparent inconsistencies. And the author of the Pentateuch isn't worried about ironing these out because mytho-history doesn't require you to give something that's entirely consistent. In any case, if you did press the Pentateuchal author as to who this woman was, he probably would say, well, it was Cain's sister. He married one of his own family members. And I think that would be unproblematic. But I think it would really, really go beyond the evidence to say on this basis that there are other people outside the Garden of Eden.
Okay, great. Thanks. Is the description of advanced agriculture among early humans in the Bible compatible with ancient and Eastern living 500,000 years ago?
No, one of the things that you find in the descriptions of Adam and Eve's descendants are manifestations of a Neolithic culture, agriculture, sheep herding, music, even metallurgy. And I would see these as simply anachronisms that are projected by the Pentateuchal author back into the primeval history. They're rather like Renaissance paintings of the times of Christ, when the ladies are portrayed in medieval madrigal gowns and the Roman soldiers are wearing medieval armor. These are anachronistic portrayals that reflect the contemporary situation of the author, but I don't think need to be taken as literal representations of the way things were at that time.
Okay. What does Dr. Craig think about the view that the fall had consequences in nature, both backwards and forwards in time? One of those things possibly being animal suffering, similar to how he thinks that Christ died for people who lived before 30 AD.
Wow, this is a heavy philosophical, theological hypothesis. I don't see any grounds for saying that there were retroactive effects of the fall. It seems to me that God created animals and that there would have been death and predation prior to the fall of man. I don't see any reason to project this backward. There is textual basis, I think, for saying that there were effects of the fall upon creation. Paul talks about how all creation groans in travail for deliverance. And you have curses pronounced by God upon the man and the woman and the earth and the snake and so forth. It's difficult to know the degree to which we should take these literally or are these part of the mythical imagery of the story. I don't think we can always separate these with clarity and certainty.
Are there any criteria for trying to decide what features of the stories in Genesis 1 through 11 should be read more historically and what features should be read more mythologically?
Well, I don't think that we should try to tease them apart in that way. I think that the blend is more like coffee and cream rather than like colored marbles put into a bag, if you understand the analogy. But I think there are some clues in the text where things should be interpreted non-literally. For example, if there are elements in the text that contradict the Pentateuchal author's own beliefs, then it's likely that those are not literally intended. And a very good example of that would be the portrayal in Genesis 2 and 3 of a sort of humanoid God who is walking in the cool of the garden, conversing with Adam and Eve, forming Adam out of the dust and blowing into his nose, and so forth. That kind of humanoid deity is more like pagan myths than it is consistent with the transcendent creator of Genesis chapter 1. And so I think that those elements of the narrative are clearly anthropomorphic and not to be read literally because they contradict the Pentateuchal author's own Jewish beliefs about what God is like. Another indication would be when the author says things that would clearly violate common sense and the knowledge common at that time if they were taken literally. Examples would include, for example, a sunrise and sunset taking place prior to the creation of the sun on the fourth day, or the idea that the Earth's primordial ocean created on day 2 could all drain away in 24 hours. When the Pentateuchal author narrates the flood, you remember, it takes over 150 days for the flood waters to drain away and the mountains to become visible. The Table of Nations in chapter 10 is not a table listed by genealogical descent. It groups peoples by political alliances, ethnicities, languages, and so forth. And the Pentateuchal author would have been aware of this. So when you have examples like this, where the narrative contradicts common sense and what would have been common knowledge, it's less probable that that is to be taken literally. And then the third one would be when there are inconsistencies in the narrative. And I've already mentioned, for example, inconsistencies between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 with respect to the order of creation. I think these are figurative elements that need not be pressed for literal accuracy. So those would give you some clues, at least, to when you're encountering elements in the story that are plausibly figurative.
Okay. If the first Adam is found among the Heidelbergenses, how then was the memory of Adam and Eve transmitted through hundreds of thousands of years?
You know, people often ask me this, and this question has quite surprised me. I have never thought that the narratives of Genesis 1 to 11 were transmitted by memory. I mean, obviously they are Israelite tradition, but I don't think these things were handed down from Adam and Eve, and that's how they got there. I take it that the author of Genesis 1 and following was inspired by God to write what he did, and that we shouldn't think that he was the recipient of some sort of a tale that had been handed down all the way from Adam and Eve to him.
Would you, this is my own follow-up to that, would you draw the line between what was directly, so to speak, inspired and what was traded down as a tradition by memory at chapter 11 and 12?
Here we get into theology again. What 2 Timothy 3:16 says is that all scripture, and by that he meant the Old Testament, all scripture is inspired by God and is therefore profitable for teaching and for correction in doctrine. And so it is the final text that we have before us that is literally God-breathed, that is inspired by God and therefore valuable for teaching and correction. And earlier I mentioned to Jesper some of those central teachings that we learn from Genesis 1 to 11. So there is no differentiation within the text, however the text came to be formed, whether by oral tradition, whether by written documents, whether it was just written by the author, however it came to be formed, inspiration is a quality of the final text, the Pentateuchal text that we have before us.
Okay, thanks. Have modern dating techniques become very accurate, or could they still be off a few hundred thousands of years?
You know, they could be off tens of thousands of years perhaps, but it wouldn't affect any of the conclusions in this book. There's no way you're going to bring humanity into the last 10 to 20,000 years ago. The dating by all of these different methods would have to be over 99% inaccurate. And that's just completely implausible in order to do such a thing.
Okay. In Genesis 18, Abraham is visited by the Lord. Many theologians have, for example, Irenaeus, have interpreted this passage to mean that the pre-incarnate Son is visiting Abraham. Is there anything that precludes us from interpreting Genesis 3 in a similar way when it speaks about the walking of God?
Yeah, I don't think there's any basis at all for thinking that in addition to his incarnation in Mary's womb, that the second person of the Trinity had another incarnation in Genesis 3. There's just no theological basis for that at all. Now, what you do have in Genesis 18 that one could talk about would be these theophanies of God, where God appears to people like Abraham in human form. Could Genesis 2 and 3 be describing a theophany? And I argue in the book that that's improbable on two grounds. First of all, Genesis 2 and 3 doesn't have the language of theophany associated with it. It's not about how then the Lord appeared to Adam and said, et cetera, et cetera. These don't have the language of a theophany. Second reason is God has this physical form in Genesis 2 and 3, even when he is not appearing to Adam and Eve. For example, when he creates Adam out of the dust of the earth and breathes into his nose the breath of life, Adam isn't conscious. God isn't appearing to Adam at that point. When God creates Eve out of his side, he puts Adam to sleep. He anesthetizes Adam, so that again, in that case, it is not an appearance to Adam. And so I don't think it's legitimate to retroject theophanies back into chapters 2 and 3. I think it's much more plausible to think that what we have here is the anthropomorphic language of myth.
Okay. Let's see here. We are soon coming up on time, so I need to think about what questions we should conclude with. How about this one that has to do with the response to your book? Why do you think you've had emotional responses from people that haven't read the book? What's so sensitive about this topic?
People are deeply invested in this. People on the right, I think, feel very insecure about their belief in Adam and Eve and Noah and the Ark and the Tower of Babel. I think they know that interpreting these passages in a literal way is in massive contradiction with modern history and linguistics and science. And so I think there's a really emotional reaction to anyone who says we don't need to read these literally. On the left, these secularists are so emotionally and adamantly opposed to God being involved in creation and for the Bible being his word and revelation to us. They want to do everything they can to discredit the Bible. And so if they can show that it's impossible for there to have been an original human pair, they will be delighted to do that. And so you have people on both the right and the left who have never read the book, but who are just having what we call a knee-jerk reaction, rejecting the conclusions that they don't like.
Now, I was just earlier today, I listened to a recent episode of your podcast, and you mentioned how perhaps this book is not for everyone. Would you say something about what your intended audience is? Who would you want to read this book? And for those who do read it, who perhaps are persuaded by your conclusions, what should they consider as they maybe share your conclusions?
This book is not written to try to persuade young Earth creationists who believe in a literal Adam and Eve. I believe in a literal Adam and Eve. The book is written to try to persuade secularists and revisionists who deny the biblical doctrine that all humanity is descended from this primordial pair that we call Adam and Eve. And so this book is primarily for people who are troubled by the question of human origins and who wonder how the biblical teaching can be made to comport with the discoveries of paleoanthropology and the other sciences of human origin.
Okay. Well, great. We are coming up on time here. Oh, okay.
We have one question from Umeå.
Oh, we have a question from the auditorium. Sure, we'll let that be the final question for tonight then,
right.
if that's all right with you, Bill.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, Umeå.
Hello, can you hear me? My question is based on what would Dr. Craig be, what's his take on the argument that even though we're moving further and further into the natural science, we still can't find an explanation for consciousness. Even though we learn more about atoms and quarks and different materials, we still don't find an explanation in the natural science for consciousness and being. What's your take on that argument?
That's a really interesting question that does come up in the final chapter of the book. In the final chapter of the book, as I say, I explore briefly mind-body dualism, and I present, I think, something like 5 arguments for why mind-body dualism is true. And one of these would be based upon the nature of intentionality, that we have consciousness of things, and that requires a soul or a mind which has mental states that are about things. And I also have arguments based upon the causal ability of consciousness to produce effects in the body, freedom of the will as well, rationality. All of these, I think, require that there be a soul or a mind that is distinct from the body, and that is the key factor that makes us human. To be human is to be a rational soul in a hominin body.
Okay. Well, I think that concludes our Q&A, and it's been a pleasure as always to hear you speak, Bill, and to hear you interact with these questions. So I want to extend a warm thank you for being with us today, and thank you for the work that you do. I want to pass on to the audience that if you would like to follow Dr. Craig's work, you can, of course, simply Google his name or the name of Reasonable Faith, which is Dr. Craig's organization and an excellent podcast to listen to.
Well, I'm very grateful, Martin, to you and to Jesper for having me on the program today. And I want to say a special thank you to all of the brothers and sisters and friends in Umeå that have joined us today as well. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill, and we'll let you go. And I'll say thank you as well to Jesper and to Staffan for helping me run this from Umeå. Thank you to the audience for all the questions and for joining us. And all of you will get a follow-up email in the next few days with info on how you can listen to or watch the recording of tonight's event and how to keep up with upcoming events such as this one. So thank you, and good night, and see you in the future.